So let's talk about The Descent Part 3. I mean Underground from 2011. But it might as well be The Descent Part 3 because this movie is clearly influenced by The Descent and almost feels like an unofficial entry into that franchise. But I digress. What is the story? Okay, so this takes place in a kind of underground military bunker. And we see in a prologue that there is some type of military experiment that's gone wrong and the government are trying to kind of dispose of it, but it's not going so well. Cut to a few years later, there is a kind of a large kind of illegal rave happening at said abandoned military sites. And after a scuffle with kind of a group of gangbangers, a group of friends are kind of driven into this kind of underground kind of bunker area where they discover these kind of subterranean kind of humanoid creatures that are particularly kind of dangerous and have a taste for human flesh. Now, what will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So to be clear, this is nothing to do with The Descent officially, but it just feels like it's clearly meant to be like an unofficial entry, so to speak. Now, what did I like about this movie? Now, I will say that the general kind of gist of the reviews that I have read is relatively negative for this movie. But I actually think this movie's, some of the critiques I have read, I actually think are positives. And let me tell you why. So in our group of friends, it consists of, I think it's like three or four guys, and, you know, probably about the same number of girls. Now, two of the guys are actually ex-military, and they kind of take charge, whilst the rest of them are kind of civilians. And a lot of the critiques I have seen is that the men are kind of like super macho, and the women are just screaming like hysterically. But I think that's a positive, because let's be honest, right? I often complain about the lack of depictions of real fear in horror movies. If you were in this situation, and bear in mind the women in this movie, the characters are not military, they are just young partygoers. Probably half of them are on drugs, right? You would be freaking out. You would be hysterical. So I don't think it's kind of like, yeah, it might be a little bit grating here and there, but I would rather have a somewhat kind of realistic reaction to, you know, killer flesh-eating kind of cannibalistic monsters whilst you're trapped underground, to sort of like underserved levels of kind of acting here. So I will say that I think that depiction of these kind of girls freaking out and kind of being hysterical, probably fairly accurate. And I kind of like that realistic depiction of fear. And also, we're talking about these guys who have served in the military. They probably would take charge and probably would try and organise this kind of group and use their training to kind of take control of the situation. So again, I don't see the problem with that critique. I actually kind of quite liked the idea of these kind of characters and stuff. You know, and we don't have anyone else who is like non-military really kind of be too macho or anything like that. So to me, I actually quite like these characters, and I thought they were relatively kind of well, kind of like developed and kind of quite realistic. We don't know tons about them, but we kind of get to know enough, and I think that the kind of archetypes that this movie sets out for them to be ring kind of true to me. And it's kind of it's somewhat crazy to me that this movie is criticised for the depictions of both these kind of types of characters, when I think they probably would be exactly like that. So, you know, there you go. So I quite liked our kind of group of characters. They're not all military, it's only a couple of them. The rest of them, you know, are just civilians. And I thought they all did a reasonable job in acting. Yes, the characters aren't particularly kind of well kind of developed. It kind of gets straight into it right from the kind of the raid. But I think we get enough to kind of understand that, you know, the situation that we're all in and kind of who these kind of guys are. It's fine. Now, this movie, as well as another plus fact, does not shy away from the gore. There is quite a lot of gory practical effects in this movie. Some of them so much so that I think sometimes it goes a little bit too too far in a way, where it's a little bit or borders on the silly side. The very kind of final gory shot in this movie, I think is like, that's a bit silly, but it looks cool, but it's like, no, I don't know if that's kind of realistic, but, you know, whatever. It's kind of fun. So if you like kind of gory movie, I mean, it's not like wall-to-wall gore, but I think when we do see some practical effects, for example, we get one woman that's kind of dragged away by these creatures, and she's kind of like being dragged by her feet, so she's face down, and she's being kind of dragged along this kind of grated floor, and well, that's what happens to her face when you kind of like put human body against like this grate. Things happen, and that's what you see. So that'll give you a kind of an idea here. And there is a little bit of CGI, not so much on the gore effects, but we'll come on to that. But the actual practical gore effects are pretty good. The kind of the creatures themselves, I mean, they are kind of more or less like the ones from The Descent. I mean, there's no getting around it. But they're still quite cool looking, and this time you actually kind of get an origin story for them that kind of ties back to a historical event. So, you know, there is that. You get a little bit more context about what it is they're actually kind of doing, you know, why they are there and things like that. I mean, there's a little bit of logic issues, it must be said, but nonetheless, at least you'll get some kind of idea here. I like the fact that this movie touches upon the kind of the trauma that having an experience like this would put someone through, because we do see sequences where people are having to ultimately kind of come to terms and kind of deal with this kind of very, very horrific event that they've kind of witnessed, which I kind of quite enjoyed as well. I thought that was kind of, you know, pretty good. These creatures are depicted to be pretty powerful, but they're not like stormtroopers. Our kind of group of heroes aren't kind of like, you know, cutting through these kind of creatures like a knife through butter. It's not until nearly the kind of the end of the movie that they actually kill their first one, you know. So these things are tough, you know, they are difficult. The best they can do is kind of fight them off and hope to kind of get away. So these kind of creatures feel genuinely quite imposing and quite difficult to kill, and genuinely quite dangerous. Again, I kind of quite liked it. The general idea of this story, I think, is fine. It doesn't. There are some logic issues, but I think if you can kind of just accept it for, you know, somewhat of a kind of a popcorny horror movie, then I think, you know, the story is kind of fine, and all that. So the actual kind of area where this is being filmed, we're meant to believe it's an underground base. I do have some problems with it, which I'll come on to, but nonetheless it's an interesting setting. Rather than the kind of the caves and stuff, that we have a slightly different kind of more industrial looking kind of location shooting here, which gives it a little bit of point difference compared to The Descent at the very least. But let's now transition to what doesn't work, and let's stick with this kind of this environment. Now, we're meant to believe this is an underground base, but although I think the context of the story, the characters, the monsters are all pretty good here, one thing that kind of bothered me with this film more than anything else is some of the technical elements. Now, again, this is an underground base, we are led to believe, but we can see various kind of light sources come through. It doesn't look like an underground base half the time. It looks like a warehouse, and I'm thinking, why? There's clearly like a window with light coming out of it. Why aren't they kind of trying to get through this window, for example? Now, if it's truly underground, it would be pitch black. I mean, they get the kind of the generator on for a time, which is fine, but then the rest of the time it would be pitch black outside of torchlights and things. But there are various kind of like lighting sources. So you're thinking, you know what? We're kind of like shattering the illusion a little bit here, because there's so much kind of like light coming from somewhere, but no one's kind of like acknowledging it. But this adds another problem, is that the movie, because it's meant to be underground, I mean, I guess this is the inevitability of having it like that, but often it's a little dark, so you can't really see what's going on. But the flip side, they have these kind of lights, and sometimes they're a bit like lens flare-y, and I'm thinking, my God, J.J. Abrams would be jealous of this movie. He's like, oh, lens flare, I love it. You know, so it kind of looks, especially sometimes when the lights are behind the characters and you just see kind of silhouettes. I have a feeling it was meant to be like a cool shot, but I'm thinking, A, where is this light coming from? B, why aren't they going towards this light and trying to either use it or go through it, wherever? And B, it kind of disguises what's kind of going on. So there's some choices here in the cinematography that I think are weak. Now, the other issue I have with this movie is the editing. Now, when we have these kind of creatures that attack, it's very, very quick edits a lot of the time. So you really lose sense of where you are and what's kind of happening in this kind of particular area, because it's lots of quick edits and lots of kind of close-ups of like gore or someone's face or something like that. You're thinking, I'm losing all sense of where this is taking place and where I am and what's kind of going on. And I get that what the movie is trying to convey is kind of a sense of kinetic fear and sort of like hysteria and chaos, but you kind of just think, I'm just looking at lots of kind of mess, really, and it's kind of a little bit irritating in regards to that. So there are some technical elements here where I felt like, you know, just as the matter of filmmaking, lets it down a little bit. And there's, again, some logic issues in regards to, this does not look like an underground bunker, it looks like a warehouse, or at least in some shots. And then again, there's some logic issues about how these things survive. If the government have known that these things are around here, how have they just gassed them out or something? You know, there's a couple of other, we meet a character later on in the movie that I don't know if made complete sense and things. So, yeah, there's a few little logic issues here and there, if you kind of think too hard about it. Yeah, and, you know, let's be honest, although I kind of quite like the characters, we don't get a huge amount of time to kind of get to know them before kind of stuff starts going on. Some of these kind of characters, I wasn't even sure who they were. You know, they meet another couple, this main group of people meet like another couple, and I'm thinking, is that the couple that they met, or is that part of the group? I don't know. Again, it's partly because of the light. It's partly because of the casting as well, and they've cast people who all look kind of similar to each other. So again, it's difficult to kind of see. I mean, again, this is one reason for diverse casting. You know, diverse casting is so you can have a point of difference about who's who. Everyone here is kind of like brown-haired Caucasian, and it's just like great. You know, we've got one blonde girl, and that's it. The rest of them kind of look more or less like everyone else. So it's difficult to kind of almost, especially in the low light, see what's happening to certain people, because you just don't know. But I found this quite an entertaining movie. There's a little bit of kind of CGI, but it's not on the gore extent that there's a couple of shots of like helicopters coming down, which are clearly CGI, things like that, a little bit of fire, but most of the practical effects are gore. I still kind of quite like this movie. No way is it as good as The Descent, which I think got that perfectly right in regards to the kind of the cinematography, all that kind of stuff, the fear. This one's more of a kind of certainly a B movie, but it's an entertaining movie, probably on par with like maybe The Descent Part 2. But it's an entertaining watch, and if you like The Descent, I'd probably check it out. But you know, obviously, don't be expecting as good a movie as that, but it's still a 6 out of 10 if you ask me. Have you seen Underground? Do let me know what your thoughts are on it, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time.